So good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Beth Hawley with the Arizona Association of Realtors, and we're proud to bring you these free webinars designed exclusively to keep you updated on issues in the industry and AAR activities. Today's webinar is Selling Solar with Laurie McDonnell and Tara Rutkowski. Laurie brings over 20 years of real estate experience to her role as designated broker for United Brokers Group. She happily and humbly shares a wealth of knowledge that comes from her extensive background spanning appraisals, sales, forum authorship, contract review, and leadership development. Widely known for her kind heart, cool-headed problem-solving, and dedication to the industry, Laurie has been elected to numerous influential advisory roles in several AAR, and ARMLS. She knows real estate from just about every angle and consistently operates with the highest level of integrity. Laurie thrives on helping others and is involved with several philanthropies, both in and out of real estate. She loves spending time with her family, reading, hiking, traveling, and watching Grease. Tara has been in the real estate industry for the past 3 years and specializes in solar homes. Along with her green designation with NAR, she has 9 years of previous experience working in the solar industry. Her experience with solar includes, but is not limited to, sales, the installation process, permitting, and utility requirements. She is a certified instructor for AAR teaching classes on solar and how it relates to real estate. She also served on the AAR workshop to create the recently released Solar Lease and Loan Addendum. It is her goal to equip agents with the knowledge and tools necessary to handle a real estate transaction concerning solar. Today's presentation will be about 35 to 45 minutes. If you have any questions during the webinar, please write them in the question box and we will try to get them answered at the conclusion. If you'd like to change the size of the webcam video, simply click on the line separating the webcam and the PowerPoint presentation and drag. As always, today's webinar will be recorded and available next week on our website at aaronline.com. So welcome, and let's get started.
And you're going to answer that for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, anytime there's a lease or a loan that is being assumed by a buyer, there is going to be a qualification by a third party. And it's either going to be the leasing company or the loan company. There is a credit requirement typically. I will say on average, it's around a 650 FICO score. However, that does vary from leasing company from one to the next. The other thing is that some leasing companies, even though the buyer may not meet that, they still work with them. Now, there might be like a prepayment of 3 months of the lease payment that have to be done up front in order for them to take it over. But typically the leasing companies out there, especially the big ones like Solar City, Sunrun, SunPower, and those, they typically will work with buyers. But it is very important that as a listing agent, you know what that credit requirement is. So make sure that your sellers are contacting the leasing company in advance, finding out what the requirements are. Another aspect of it is not just credit score requirement, but also the debt to income ratio. Out there today, many lenders count the lease payment as debt, and so that counts against their DTI. It is imperative, if you're a listing agent, that when you receive an offer on your desk, that you contact that lender of the buyer and reach out to them and ask them, if I incorporate this, whatever the lease payment amount is that going to be a problem for the buyer to qualify? You can also ask the lender at that time, the requirement to assume the lease is the credit score, let's say 650. Is that going to be an issue for your client? They cannot tell you the actual credit score that the buyer has, but they can let you know if it's going to be a concern or not. That really is a listing agent's due diligence to do up front, because that way you're not taking the listing off the market for somebody who is not going to qualify. So I sincerely encourage you to do your due diligence up front and to be proactive rather than reactive in this scenario when it comes to credit score requirements and debt to income ratios.
That's great information. And so what do you think about value impact and appraisals related to solar, especially lease, obviously? And is there impact on value? And do appraisers mostly use comps with lease solar? How does that work?
Well, actually, in the appraisal process, Fannie Mae, FHA, and Freddie Mac, none of them will allow a lease system to be included as value for the home.
Right.
So there is no appraisal value for lease solar of any kind. And I know that there's different types of lease solar out there. Monthly payment lease solar, and then there's also prepaid lease solar where there's no monthly payments and it's been paid up front. Unfortunately, our guidelines are that no leased solar can add value. So if it's leased, you're not as concerned about an appraisal. However, if it's owned, you do want to be concerned about the appraisal process. And another good point and a good tip in this particular scenario is if you have a home that has owned solar on it, again, you want to contact the lender immediately if you're the listing agent, and you want to let the lender know the house has owned solar on it, and request that they send an appraiser that knows how to value owned solar when there's no comps. Because it's one thing when there are comps, but the truth is with solar systems, it's highly unlikely to find an exact comp in the neighborhood that has the exact same even system size. Because system sizes are different and they are valued different based on how much money they save. But if as a listing agent you do your due diligence up front and just notify the lender that there is a owned solar system on the property, they will then communicate that to the appraisal company. And again, you're being proactive rather than reactive, because we all know how hard it can be to fight an appraisal after the fact.
Sure.
So just do your due diligence up front and request somebody who knows what they're doing. And I do this all the time, and honestly, they've never sent me anybody that knew nothing. And I always have met value, ironically, in that circumstance. But if you wait, then you're too late once the appraiser's already set foot if they give no value.
And has it been your experience that the appraisers are using comps of homes with owned solar? Is that a requirement?
No, it's not.
Okay.
If an appraiser knows what they're doing, they will understand and know how to value the solar without comps. And that's why I say make sure they send somebody that knows how to value it without, because comps are not common. And I will be very honest with you, there's a wide range of what I've seen out there as far as value goes, but I think that with the way that it was several years ago versus how it is today is very different. Appraisers have become educated. They've taken classes and things like that to learn how to value solar. So that's not as big of an issue as what it used to be. A lot of times we're seeing values come in similar to what a pool value would be.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough. I think that's fair. Okay, so there used to be a time when you would hear that, properties that are listed with leased solar would be on the market longer. Is that true? Are we seeing that in the market?
Well, interestingly enough, no, we're not. So, and again, I'm going to encourage you, if you're interested in your specific area, you should really pull the data in the MLS. We all have access to that, and you can choose solar panels, and you can even filter between leased or owned, and really search in that capacity in a specific area. But honestly, so I'll give you guys some statistics. So last year of over 2017, the average days on market for all non-solar homes was 70 days. The average days on market for leased solar home was 70 days.
Wow.
It matched.
Okay.
So I know we hear a lot of that says, oh, it takes so much longer to sell a leased solar home. The truth is that I think that buyers recognize value with solar, whether it's leased or owned. But ultimately, buyers recognize it, but I think we as the real estate industry have heard the horror stories. Right. So we're fearful of it. But buyers out there are actually becoming more savvy, and the millennial generation in particular sometimes will be specifically looking for solar homes. And it doesn't matter whether it's leased or owned. There's a recognition that it saves money. So, the days on market are interesting. Now, as far as value goes, we are seeing a trend, especially over the past year in 2017, that leased solar homes did sell for a slightly lower price per square foot than what we saw non-solar homes go for. But what's interesting is that, so that tells me that real estate agents sometimes are discounting the homes because they're fearful. So they're saying, oh, it's going to be harder. We're going to have to give a bargain deal. So I would encourage you not to do that, but rather to just price it like any other house on the market and educate yourself on solar so that way you can answer and overcome the objections when they come from buyers or other agents that may be showing your home.
And I guess it's also perception, right? And knowledge is power. So if you have the stats and you have the information, then you don't need to worry about it.
That's right. So let's talk about perception just a little bit. I have found that our perception or our beliefs sometimes create our reality for ourselves, but the truth is that sometimes it's not the true reality in there. For example, if I ask like our audience, how much would somebody pay on average in an 1,800 square foot home that lived there year round? What would their average utility bill be? I would get a slew of answers. I would get anywhere probably from as low as $100 a month all the way up to some people see over $300 a month. And we're talking about the same square footage of home. And that's the problem or the concern out there when it comes to solar, because the solar lease, for example, exposes a portion of what it costs to operate that property. Okay. So, but if we have a perception that an 1,800 square foot home should only cost $125 a month on average, but the reality is that home actually costs $300 a month, our perception is not real. But we're creating that, and we're telling our buyers, that lease payment of $150 a month on that 1,800 square foot home seems like it's too high. But that might not really be. So I encourage everybody out there to really not allow your perception to get in the way of what reality might be, because you have no way of knowing if that solar payment is saving them money or not saving them money unless you actually have the bills from a home before they had the solar put on and can compare them to the bills now with the lease payment. So that's the number one thing out there is to really put reality in line, and don't assume something is a good or a bad deal because you might not know. You don't know. It is very, very difficult to determine what is a good deal and what is not.
Yeah. Okay. So what about, that technology changes and that the equipment might become obsolete? What would you say about that?
I would say a lot of that is myth out there too. So I've heard a lot of people say, an inverter, which is a part of the solar system, only will last for 5 years. The truth is, all inverters out there have a minimum 10-year warranty, and those are the grid-tied inverters. So, and a lot of them even have options for extended warranties to go up to 25 years. So inverters are going to last at minimum 10 years, and if they don't last that long, then they're covered by the manufacturer. Solar panels themselves have a warranty of 25 years, and that's a performance warranty. And that's the other thing is people say, the panels are going to be dead after 10 years. That's not true. The average degradation rate, or the rate at which they decline in production, is between 0.25% to 0.5% per year. I have solar on my own home, of course, and my system, ironically, I showed increased production over the past 3 years rather than a decrease, because weather affected my production more than the actual degradation of the system. So be aware that the technology with solar is not the same as what you see with cell phones or the computers and things like that. It's a slow progress. And really where technology is advancing right now is in battery and storage capabilities. Because of the changes that just took place with APS and took place 3 years ago with SRP, with net metering going away, storage and energy management systems are becoming more prevalent, and we're going to see more of those in the marketplace today.
Okay, great. It sounds like knowledge, learning and doing your research before you get involved too much if solar is important to a buyer.
Right.
How about you hear that sometimes lease payments go up in these leases, and what would you say to that?
Okay, so that's a really good point. So yes, a lot of the leasing companies out there or leases that exist have what's called an escalator. And typically the escalator ranges from what I've seen anywhere from 0.9% up to 2.9%, with the more popular being at the 2.9%. So what happens when a homeowner has entered into one of those leases is the payment starts out lower in the beginning years, and it goes up annually by a fixed percentage each year. So let's say 2.9%. So a lot of people will ask, that seems like it's going up every year. But we have to ask ourselves, are the utility companies, our SRP and APS, are they going to stay fixed forever? And we know that that's not true. We know that they don't go up necessarily every single year, but they have every other year where they can go up. And then, and just this past year, we had a 4.5% increase with APS. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Also, people will say, just to give you guys a general idea, the difference in what a homeowner will pay on a fixed lease versus an escalating lease, and this would be like a 2.9%, and this is an average, okay? But it's typically about $2,300 more over the course of 20 years. Okay. So if you think about assuming a lease, somebody's already assumed some of that inclination, so you're not assuming all of it. The other question that I get a lot is, well, why would somebody make a payment for 20 years and not own it at the end? Well, you guys, the truth is, we make payments to the utility company every single month, year after year after year, and we don't own anything with them either. So a solar lease, I'm going to encourage you guys to think of it, it's a utility bill. It's buying energy differently from somewhere else rather than the current utility company. And if you look at it simply as a utility bill and not as an investment, because it's not an investment when you're making a payment and you don't own it at the end. You're just buying somewhere else at a predetermined rate for a certain number of years. And that changes the perception. It's not an investment. It's just buying energy differently.
Right. So there's lots of moving parts, right? I mean, so what would you say from the beginning, probably getting ahead of all of it, what would be best practice for agents to be doing at the very beginning of the process?
Yes. If you are the listing agent and you are taking the listing, there are things that you need to have in advance. So you need to have the lease agreement or the loan agreement or any contract documents that pertain to the solar, even if it's owned, because anything you can provide to a buyer is proper disclosure, okay? So making sure that you have that, making sure that the leasing company, you understand what the current payment is and what the credit requirements are. Your seller should be able to find that information out. They need to contact the leasing company prior to you putting their house on the MLS. I sell real estate myself. I've sold a home on day 0. You never know when that buyer is going to come, and you could be in a multiple offer situation or sell it right away. So it is important that you be prepared to have that information up front, because the more prepared you are, the better you're representing your seller. So getting all that information, and I don't recommend going on the MLS until we have that, because the solar lease and loan addendum that we're going to discuss in just a minute basically is going to require you, because there's deadlines and time frames, to have this information up front. One of the biggest reasons why we needed it is because people were not following a proper timeline. We're getting 10 days before close of escrow and nobody has notified the leasing company. All of a sudden buyer doesn't qualify and now everybody's mad.
Yeah.
So let's be proactive.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to expectations, right?
Yeah.
In all parts of the contract. So just getting ahead of things that might happen and just be aware of it.
Absolutely. And I will say this just as a note before I forget. There are agents out there that don't know that this form exists. So if you have a listing with solar and you are putting it on the MLS, please include the solar lease and loan addendum in the documents tab, just like you would an HOA addendum. And in reference in the private remarks that the agent is to include that with the contract.
Yeah, just make sure it's under the private documents. Yeah.
Right.
So with that, why don't we go ahead and get started and just sort of go through the form. The form came out in October 2017, and there's some contingencies built into it, which are, I think, great. Obviously, the first contingency, the section of the addendum that references that the sale is contingent upon the buyer qualifying and being able to assume the lease on the property.
Absolutely.
And so they go through, so there's that contingency that's built in on lines 10 through 11. And from there, we go into the seller disclosure, what the requirements are for the seller. And we decided with the work group that we would essentially mirror what the disclosure is for the seller's property disclosure, which is now 3 days.
That's correct.
So within 3 days of contract acceptance, the seller needs to deliver the most recent version of the solar system loan, which evidently the lease changes. So they need to provide the buyer with the most current document that they have, and they need to deliver system documents to anything they have in their possession to the buyer, and provide the name and phone number of the lessor so the buyer can start that process.
Right. And then the third thing, and this is why I like it, because the third thing, it requires the sellers to notify the lessor of the sale. They have to provide to the lessor the name of the buyer, the name of the escrow company, and start that transfer process. Because if you are proactive in this, you essentially can get all of this taken care of in your 10-day inspection window. Ideally, that was the goal of this, is to force buyers and sellers to agree upon all this stuff within that 10-day inspection window. And hopefully by the end of it, we have qualification with the leasing company and everything else so that we're moving forward and you've not taken the house off the market if somebody doesn't qualify or they decide that they don't like it.
Right. And to your point about getting all of those documents ahead of time so that there's not that rush once you're under contract, the seller knows what they need to have and everything's ready to go.
Right, because these are calendar days, not business days. And so if you go under contract on a Friday and a Monday's a holiday, Tuesday, I mean, you're too late at this point in time. You've now missed the deadline and you're in breach of contract. Yeah. And you can be cured. It's a curable.
Agreed. So do you want to talk about the buyer or the buyer due diligence? Excuse me.
Yeah. So in here, we wanted to make sure that as a buyer that we included bullet points of anything that may be material to them. So as a work group, we came together and we're like, what are all the possible options and things that a buyer should take into consideration when they are assuming a solar lease or loan? And, we have them bulleted because it's easier to read bullet points.
Right.
So again, and I talk about this on one of these items here is utility bills. My recommendation is that if a buyer, we have our lease payment, we know what that is, but really a buyer should also be asking for the utility bills.
Sure.
And if you don't do this already, guys, you really should be asking for utility bills from any home because it really is a cost of operating that house.
Sure.
And I think so often we fail to really ask the non-solar homeowners for their bills, but a lot of buyers could be very shocked when they get their bills come summertime. So let's be fair, and if you're asking for, you obviously want to see them on a solar home for sure because you want to be able to add the utility bills to what the lease payment is to find out what the total bill is or the loan payment. But also do that for non-solar homes because that's doing your due diligence for buyers. Sorry, got off on a tangent.
No, I think that's great. That's a great point.
But basically, these items are here. It's what we came up with because it's the majority of items that they should take into consideration when they're assuming a lease or a loan with solar.
Right. And obviously, they can look into other things too, right?
Anything they want. But, this is just like the 10-day inspection period.
Right.
Ultimately for them to do all inspections that are required.
Right. So then the buyer disapproval also, again, mirrors the buyer disapproval for the VINSR, the inspection period. So the buyer would need to give notice of disapproved items within 5 days after receipt of the seller's property disclosure, solar system documents, and they need to notify in writing if there's anything disapproved having to do with that.
Exactly. So it's 5 days or the inspection period, whichever is later.
Right.
So if you do not get this documentation to the buyer until day 8 of the inspection period, guess what? They have 3 days after that in order to cancel contract on you. Again, being proactive and having everything up front, provide it to them just like you do the SPUDs. And actually, our SPUDs require the lease to be attached here too. If you read it, it's just, so that's already in there. But a lot of people didn't read that little fine print and would just submit the SPUDs without the lease agreement. So having that. Now, if a buyer decides that they don't want the solar, they don't agree with the terms, then on the VINSR, you would check the box, premises rejected, and, a buyer does not agree with solar lease agreement or lease, transfer agreement.
Right. Yeah, you definitely want to list whatever it is that's disapproved.
Exactly. And then, so basically that's the process. And as long as the listing agent gets this information within that first 3 days, then it's going to be it's going to be a VINSR cancellation. And that's what we want.
Right. And then, so if they don't disapprove of items, it's deemed that they're moving forward, they're accepting of the solar system and the documents and what they've reviewed, and that they are going to get that process started.
Yes, exactly. So that's another thing, because once you've notified the leasing company that the transfer of the buyer's name and contact information typically is what they ask for, then they will actually start that process, and then they will send out the credit application to the buyer. That buyer, based on the way that this is written, is to immediately apply for the lease or loan assumption approval. We had a big conversation about this. There was a lot of talk of wanting to include a deadline of time frame on this. But the problem is we cannot rely on a third party of when they're going to release the credit application. So that's why there's no hardcore time frame on here. But when we say immediately, like when that credit application goes out and they receive it, they should be doing it, in my opinion, within 24 24 to 48 hours. That, in my opinion, that's immediately.
Yeah.
And I think we looked at that, and everybody would understand what immediately meant. And if they're not doing that, and we know that it's gone out, then it's following up, making sure that they actually received it, because a lot of these things are sent out via email. So we could go into spam or to junk. But if they've received it and we can confirm, they need to do it immediately. And honestly, I'm in a transaction right now. We had completed, and buyer was sent the loan or the lease credit application, and they completed it even before the end of the 10-day inspection period, and we're moving forward.
Perfect. That's great.
Yeah.
That's what you want.
I do. Like relief for me, and relief for any listing agent, because now your home is not taken off the market for a non-qualified buyer. But remember, you still have to check with that lender for DTI reasons.
Right. Okay. So the next piece of this is where it goes into the assumption, the contingency, right? So how it reads is that the buyer's obligation to complete the sale is contingent upon buyer obtaining lessor approval to assume the solar system lease loan. And the key here is under the existing terms and conditions. So it has been known that sometimes the lease changes and the buyer gets the documents and it's not what they thought it would be. So they are not obligated to accept new terms and conditions. They are only required for this to be approved under what's existing.
That's correct. Whatever was supplied to them. So if you supply to them documents that are not current, then and new documents come out that are different from the original agreement, then buyer would have the option to cancel at that time because the terms change. I think that that's not as common. From what I've seen, most of our big leasing companies, again, the terms of the contract that the original homeowner kept continue on with the new, because that's a true assumption is when you're assuming the original terms and conditions. But it's something to be aware of and to check for sure.
And then also with that is the time frame. So it flows with the loan contingency that it's needs to happen within 3 days prior to the close of escrow.
That's correct.
Yeah. So do you want to talk about the unfulfilled in the event that there's an issue there, that bottom part here, the unfulfilled loan?
Yeah, so basically in the event that everything goes planned, the buyer does get their earnest money back in the event that, they were in compliance and they did everything they were supposed to do. They are entitled to getting their earnest money back. If they want to cancel,
if you couldn't get the assumption.
If they couldn't get the assumption, yes, they're entitled to getting their earnest money back, just like we would have exactly with the loan contingency that we have in our purchase contract today. Now, if they decide after the inspection period that they just, and they've already agreed to everything and they agree to the BINSR, and they decide midway through, we've changed our mind on the lease, that would be a cancellation, and then they would not be entitled to their earnest money deposit because they'd be canceling for a reason that they already agreed to. Again, another important reason to make sure everything happens during the inspection time frame.
And I think the key, too, is also that if they don't provide that notice, the seller may cure as per the contract.
Yes.
And that's per Section 7A.
Yes, that's correct.
The cure notice. Okay. And then on the last part of the form, we've got the exculpatory, the sort of acknowledgement of, whether or not the buyer and seller should not be relying on their agent in terms of the expertise for the solar piece. They need to do their own due diligence and obviously investigate anything material to them during their inspection period.
Yes, as an agent, please do not be reading and deciphering the legal contract language of the lease or the loan.
Yeah.
If they need further advice, then they need to contact their attorney or get legal advice in a different way. You don't want to be the one reading it and saying, well, this is what it says.
Yeah.
Because that could open yourself up for a very big lawsuit.
What do we say? Be the source of the source.
That's right.
Yes, I think so.
And a lot of times I will say that, like for example, Solar City, they assign a lease transfer specialist, to that, and they are available to receive phone calls, and the buyers can ask them those questions and get answers so that it's not you, but you're just providing the source again.
Exactly. So any other thoughts or in terms of the form, do you think?
I think, we want to talk about, just remember that this is a solar lease and loan assumption addendum. So if this is owned solar on the property, you do not use this form. It is no different than selling a house with owned solar than it is with selling a house with a pool. The solar comes with the property. Now, I am aware that sometimes sellers, they want to take their solar with them. In that aspect, it would need to be written into the purchase contract that the solar will not convey, because technically it is a fixture on the property. That's a whole nother thing I don't necessarily recommend, because As a buyer, I would want to know who's going to warrant the roof that's
Right.
going to be taken off.
Right.
So I don't necessarily recommend personally people removing solar systems from properties. And I really don't even recommend that, even though some leasing companies will give that, because again, you go back to and who's going to warrant the roof. So it gets complicated.
Yeah, agreed. And that always concerns me too when I see
Yeah.
that someone wants to take it with them. And there's a lot of moving parts with that as well.
Yeah, and I'll say one other thing too. You know, when sellers, they decide to go and sell their home, and in the MLS, you can search whether it's leased solar or owned solar. So if your clients are dead set against not wanting leased solar, then filter that out and don't show them. Because to go and try to change everything and say, oh, well, I like your house, but I don't like your solar lease, buy it out or, remove it, that is really an awful thing to ask a seller, because they're going to be on the losing end. And if they've marketed in the MLS that they're going to assume the transfer, that's what their intentions are. So respect that. Don't show a house if they don't want leased solar. Show other homes. But to go and say, I like it, but I don't like this, it's kind of like the same thing with a pool. Oh, I like the house, but I don't like your pool. Well, you fill it in. No, that wasn't how it was marketed in the MLS. So I make humor out of it but it happens out there. And, just be respectful in that way and know that, it costs the seller a lot of money. And so it's unlikely that they would be willing to do that.
Right. And there's a pretty good expense involved.
There's a big expense involved.
What do you think about prepaid solar?
I really like prepaid solar on a buyer's side. Yeah. I think prepaid solar is great. I think it's unfortunate for the sellers because they basically prepaid for this much time frame and there's no appraisal value added. So that's a downside to them. But as far as prepaid solar, if you have a buyer and you find a house that has prepaid solar lease, I would jump on that in a minute.
So there's not any generally issues associated with that?
There's no credit. There's usually no credit requirements. There's no DTI because there's no payments. It's just free power.
And so is there equipment buyout at the end as well?
Some leases will offer that, but not all.
Okay.
So that's where the contracts really have to be written and read, or not written, but read on how they are, because each leasing company that's out there, and there's a whole slew of them. There's over a dozen of them that I know of off the top of my head.
Right.
So they all have different terms and conditions for what happens at the transfer of the lease, as well as what happens at end of lease terms. So that would be an end of lease term if there's a buyout option. I can tell you right now, in the majority of Solar City leases, there's never a buyout option, okay? But with Sunrun and SunPower and different other leasing companies out there, NRG, there are usually buyout options. But again, that's not all of them, because some of them have changed their leases as the years have gone along, just like lenders have changed different loan programs and things like that. So you have to read the individual lease, or the buyer needs to read that individual lease to find out what the options are. But yes, many times there are buyout options depending on who the leasing company is.
Okay. So again, checking into all of that ahead of time.
Yes, exactly. And reading the contracts, not you as the agent, let me just make that clear, but the buyer needs to be reading that contract.
And making those calls.
That's correct.
Okay, great. So we have a question. Let's see. Sarah is asking, can you please give me the verbiage example? Again, buyer assuming existing solar lease. Sale is contingent on buyer obtaining lender and Solar City approval to assume. I'm not sure I understand.
I think she's wanting to know how you write that in the contract.
You don't.
You don't. You just incorporate the solar lease and loan addendum into the contract, and that covers you.
Right. So on page 1 of the offer, you are checking the box if this is incorporated, and you would use this.
Right. It's actually not a box on our contract, so we have to do other and write in solar lease and loan assumption addendum.
Right. Great question.
Mm-hmm. And please, so I'll make an extra note on this. If you receive an offer and you're the listing agent and this is not incorporated, you must incorporate it, meaning you're going to do a counter offer and you're going to include the solar lease and loan addendum written into the counter offer. Bring it in. Yeah. Because you are definitely not doing yourself any justice, or your sellers or the buyers, if this is not incorporated.
Absolutely. Let's see. So Sarah is asking, if you are representing a buyer, you would add it to the right, the contingent verbiage.
All you have to do, the contingency is already in the solar lease and loan addendum, so you would just incorporate this initially up front. I think,
Yeah. think that should answer the question. You're welcome, Sarah. So do you have any closing thoughts on, or any other information we haven't covered? I feel like we've covered a lot.
We have covered a lot. I mean, I will state that I do teach a solar disclosure class. So if you ever have an opportunity to attend one of my classes, I encourage you to. I do have a lot of experience in the solar industry, and I am actively helping agents to resolve certain issues that happen when they have a solar concern. So if you can come, I would encourage you to do that, because I can promise you, but by the end of the 3 hours, you will know more than most solar customers out there, because I will teach you what you need to know to effectively handle the transaction, and I give a lot more information than what we've given in this seminar.
Sure.
So.
And I can vouch for, I mean, you did the class for us, the CE class, and my agents were thrilled. They still talk about it. So it was a great class, and I highly recommend it.
And if you have your broker, if you want to ask your broker to bring me in, I'm more than happy.
Yeah.
And or if you have a lender, or or somebody that you know of that does CE classes regularly, we can go together with sponsors, and then I'm happy to teach it. Just have them reach out to me directly.
And do you know what are the hours? Is it disclosure?
It's 3 hours of CE disclosure.
Okay, perfect. Awesome.
Yes.
Well, thank you. I think that wraps it up.
They want my phone number.
Oh.
Okay, so I'm going to give you my phone number. It's 623-640-6546 is my cell.
Awesome.
Okay, great. Well, thank you both for being here. It was incredibly informative. I do need to make a note that we had some audio issues at the very beginning, so I missed the intro.
Oh, okay.
And about the first minute of you speaking, that was entirely my fault. I apologize. But that will be fixed on the recording. So thank you all, and we hope to see you at our next event.
Absolutely. Thank you.